Today, Mr. President, I want to talk about some good news. And the good news is that here in Congress, we actually did something with the tax relief and tax reform legislation that is already creating a better economy and more hope for people. There was news announced today, just a few minutes ago, that is, in addition to the news we've heard over the last few weeks, this historic tax reform was created, you remember, with two goals in mind. One was to cut taxes for middle-class families, so individual tax cuts. The second part of it was, okay, let's make America a better place to do business. Let's ensure there'll be more jobs created here rather than elsewhere. Let's level the playing field so our workers aren't competing with one hand tied behind their back. As I've said through the process as we developed this bill, and we had a bipartisan agreement that our tax code was broken, but we couldn't seem to come up with an agreement as how to fix it. And some Democrats said, well, that's great, you guys have done this bill, but it's not going to help. And I said at the time, the proof will be in what happens. What happens to jobs? What happens to wages? What happens to the economy in general? What happens to your paycheck? And I'm here to announce today that the results have been pretty darn impressive. And they've been across the board, all those things I talked about. We've already seen as a result of this tax legislation that America has become a better place to do business. And all over the country, there are companies, businesses, small and large, that have stepped forward to talk about that. I now have a list of 150 businesses, and I'm sure there are many, many more that have decided to do something, either announced a pay increase or a bonus or an increased 401k contribution or an increased pension contribution or maybe a new investment in equipment and technology to make workers more competitive. And all of this specifically because of the tax relief and reform bill. That's what's happening. And for those who haven't followed it, even today, another company, the largest employer in my state, Walmart, announced that they were indeed going to increase pay, provide bonuses to over 1 million workers. So some companies actually have announced a combination of these things, not just a pay increase, but maybe a pay increase and also an increased contribution to a 401k or an increased contribution to a charity. So I think we are already seeing the direct and very positive, beneficial effects of this tax reform legislation, as many of us had hoped that we would see, given the fact that we wrote it to create these incentives for more jobs and better jobs. But today, we're going to begin to see the direct effects of the other part of the bill, and that is the tax relief directly to individuals. The IRS just announced about an hour ago that they are publishing updates to the tax withholding tables for employers. Now, what does this mean? This means that Uncle Sam is going to take a little less of your paycheck, and you're going to see it on the paycheck. So the withholding, the amount that's withheld from your paycheck for taxes, is going to be changed. The Treasury Department says that for 90% of Americans, 90%, there will be a change in withholding that will be positive for them. In other words, they'll have less money coming out of their paycheck. Most people who I represent in my home state of Ohio live paycheck to paycheck. This is really important. And we've talked earlier about how much this is going to be. Is it $2,000 a family on average? That's the median income family in Ohio. Whatever the amount is, this is significant. And it's something that people are going to be, I think, pretty surprised about because, again, so many people have misrepresented what this legislation is about. They're now seeing it's about jobs and it's about wages, it's about bonuses and so on, but they're also going to see in their own paycheck that it's about more take-home pay. It's about having a little healthier family budget. So, again, as we went through this process, when we would have these debates, I would say, look, I just encourage people to look online, look at the professionals, go on a tax calculator. And I said, the proof is in your paycheck. And I think the proof will be in people's paychecks. More hard-earned money staying in your pocket rather than going to Washington is something that my constituents will like, particularly as you see this economy beginning to pick up because of the tax reform bill, which, by the way, will result in a stronger economy, therefore more revenue through growth. So the federal government will have more revenue coming in. Every 1% increase in GDP, so 1% increase in growth in this country means about $2.7 trillion in increased revenue coming into the federal coffers. So that's more revenue coming in, not from tax increases, but from growth. That's the kind of revenue we want to have to be able to deal with many issues we face on the fiscal side, including our large deficits and debt. And that also we'll begin to see as you see a better economy developing because of this tax reform legislation. That's my strong belief, and I think, again, the evidence is pretty clear that we're headed that way. I want to commend the IRS for moving so quickly, because this, is pretty quick for us to turn it around. We just passed the legislation at the end of the year. It became effective on January 1st. Here we are on the 11th of January, and we're already seeing them changing the withholding that's going to go to the employers, so employers will withhold less from people's paychecks. I also want to personally commend the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, because I know he has a passion to being sure that hardworking taxpayers get this tax relief as soon as possible. And my sense is that he's the one who has promoted us moving quickly on this in a professional way, in a careful way, so the withholding tables are accurate, but ensuring that we do allow people to begin to have a little more in their paychecks to be able to help make ends meet. Again, with most people I represent living paycheck to paycheck, this is a big deal. And Stephen Mnuchin has been, I think, essential to getting this done as quickly as it has, as he was essential in the tax reform legislation, along with Gary Cohn of the White House and others. So this law is going to help middle-class families in three main ways. First, again, it cuts taxes across the board. As I noted, the IRS announcement means that about 90% of taxpayers will see more money in their paychecks. They do this in a number of ways in the tax reform legislation, and I'm talking about the reform notice here. It's notice 1036, and for those who want to go online and look at it, just go on the IRS website, irs.gov. You can see it. This is the new withholding tables. And they lay all this out, depending on how much your paycheck is, whether you're a weekly pay, bi-weekly, semi-monthly, or monthly payroll, you see what your benefits are going to be. But it happens because there is a doubling of the standard deduction, and most people already take the standard deduction in my state of Ohio. Now more people will take it because there's a doubling there, and essentially a zero tax bracket. So it goes from about $12,000 a family to about $24,000 a family. It also has a lowering of the rate of tax. So your tax rate is going to be lower relative to what it was before this. And third, if you have kids, you get a doubling of the child tax credit, including part of that being an increase in the refundability of that if you don't have income tax liability. But you still have expenses, you still have payroll taxes, you get some benefit there. So these are the kinds of things that combined end up with this notice going out saying you're going to have a little more in your paycheck. Second, the result of these tax cuts is going to take about 3 million Americans off the tax rolls altogether. I say about because the Joint Committee on Taxation doesn't have the final number yet, but they have told me it's at least 3 million Americans who now pay income taxes who will no longer have income tax liability. Now, they may have payroll tax liability, they may have state and local taxes, but the point is this was about federal income tax reform and federal income tax relief. They're going to be out from under the IRS and, again, be able to help make ends meet. That's as a result of this legislation. I said earlier that about $2,000 per family is the average of a median family income in Ohio, $2,000 a year in tax relief. That's about the average. This is important because as expenses have gone up over the last couple of decades, particularly healthcare expenses in the last decade, wages have not. So wages have been relatively flat. In fact, on average, when you take inflation into account, they have been flat the last couple decades. We're beginning to see some increase in wages now. That's terrific. But with wages being flat and expenses up, people have had a real squeeze. And that middle-class squeeze is real in my home state. So this is extra money that families, many people living paycheck to paycheck, can use to pay for expenses like health care, maybe make a car payment that they have to make, save for retirement, maybe help their kids. The second goal of this tax reform, boosting the American economy, is also beginning to happen, as I said earlier. When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act became law, immediately you saw a number of companies, businesses, small and large around the country, say, we're going to do something about this. I remember being home over the holidays, and actually the day after Christmas, the 26th of December, I was talking with friends, and a guy who owns a small manufacturing business, a brother of a friend of mine, said, would you be willing to come out to our little company to talk about the tax bill? And I said, well, sure, if we can figure it out schedule-wise. He said, because I want to give my employees a bonus. I'm looking at this tax bill and how it's going to affect our little business, what it's going to do for us to be able to invest more in the company, and I want to give my employees a $1,000 bonus, everybody, 137 employees, and I also want to do something in terms of making investments in our equipment because I want to make my people more competitive. This is a small manufacturer in Cincinnati, Ohio, that makes a product, high-quality product, precision product, and he wants to be sure that his people have the best equipment to be able to be competitive. In his case, he's got competition from overseas, as do a lot of American businesses, either directly or indirectly these days in an increasingly global economy, and he wanted to be sure that that could happen. So I went there. I went to the company, Sheffer Corporation. I had the opportunity to talk about the tax reform bill, what it does across the board. He made the announcement. I can tell you people were very happy, very happy, because, again, these are folks that work hard, play by the rules, aren't looking for any kind of a handout, but what they do want is to be able to know that if they work hard and do the right thing, that they're going to be able to see a little better future for themselves and their kids and their grandkids, and not have that middle-class squeeze we talked about where wages are flat, expenses are up. And with the economy that's not growing at a fast rate, which is what we've seen the last decade, it's really a challenge. When you have an economy growing at 2% or less, it's tough to see that kind of hope and opportunity. Now, with this tax reform bill, I think we have a much better chance of seeing that. And in fact, looking at some of the projections for next year, it looks like most people think the economy is going to grow at better than 2%, maybe 3%, maybe a little higher. We don't know. But the point is, people are going to have more hope and opportunity. It's not just Sheffer, though. In my hometown of Cincinnati, the Fifth Third Bank announced a company-wide wage increase. So wages are going to go up for entry-level jobs and push all wages, and also bonuses. This is for 13,000 employees in Cincinnati. Across the country, we've seen this. Tomorrow, I'll be at a plant in Cleveland, Ohio, that is putting more money into their pension plan. I think it's going to be about $50 million into a pension plan that isn't in terrible shape, but it could be a lot healthier. That's going to help those employees directly. Last Friday, I was at a plant in Columbus, Ohio, again, small manufacturer. It's a metal forming plant. Wolf Metals, they do an awesome job there, competing again with people all around the globe. And what they're going to do is make more investments in equipment. In fact, I like this comparison to the tax bill, because one of the pieces of equipment, about $1 million piece of equipment they want to replace with the tax bill savings, is 32 years old. The tax code that we reformed was 31 years old. And so it's time, don't you think, every few decades to actually reform our tax code, to bring it up to speed, to make it more competitive, to give our workers the edge, just as it's time to replace that machine, to give his employees the ability to compete globally. Nationwide Insurance, Columbus, Ohio, is going to reinvest in their workers. Western and Southern Financial Group, Boeing, Comcast, AT&T are some of the big companies you've heard about. They've all announced increased investments in their workers, new investments in their operations, or both as a result of this law. With regard to Walmart, they employ about 1.5 million Americans now. As I said, largest employer in Ohio with over 50,000 employees. They're going to raise wages, provide bonuses, and expand benefits for their workers as a result of this tax reform legislation. So these are the results. This isn't hypothetical. It's not something that we're just saying might happen. It's something that's actually happening. I think every single American is going to see a benefit from this, because a stronger economy helps everybody. So the 90% of people that see their withholding changing so they have more tax relief, they're obviously going to see it. The people who work in all these businesses we talked about are going to see it. But also all of us benefit. President John F. Kennedy once said something that I think makes a lot of sense. He talked about a rising tide. He said a rising tide lifts all ships. In other words, it helps to have a growing economy. These results are going to help with regard to our competitiveness, too, because right now we have a situation where, because of our tax code, jobs and investment are going overseas. And you may not hear as much about this, but what you're going to see is fewer foreign companies buying U.S. companies, and therefore less investment in jobs going overseas. Last year, think about it, 2016, last year for which we have numbers, 3 times as many American companies were bought by foreign companies as the other way around. Ernst & Young has done a study saying over the past 13 years, there are 4,700 American companies that were purchased by a foreign company that otherwise would still be American if we had this tax bill in place that we have now. So part of the results of this tax reform and tax cut legislation we're talking about today, it's obvious. You're going to see better jobs, higher wages, more investment in these companies, more investment in retirement, all the things that we all want to see, Republican and Democrat alike. Part of it is the tax cuts. And again, today with this IRS announcement, people are going to see it in their paychecks. If not this next pay period, you'll see it before February 15th, because that's what the Treasury Department is requiring companies to do. So it's coming soon. But the other part that you may not see, but that is very real, is that this decline we have seen in American competitiveness, and the result being jobs and investment going overseas, is going to start to reverse. And I will tell you, it's none too late. I mean, we needed to do this years ago. Many of us have been talking about it for years, but finally, we are putting American workers in a position where they can compete and they can win. Isn't that what it's all about? Why do we want these companies going overseas? 4,700 companies. Why do we want 3 times as many American companies bought by foreign companies the other way around? We don't want that. What we want is people to say, you know what, I'm going to invest in America and American workers. I believe we have so many advantages in this country, and we're so blessed to be Americans. We have great universities. We have the opportunity here through our workforce to be as productive as anybody in the world. But when you have a tax code that's holding us back, it's unfair. And it's our responsibility as members of Congress to fix it, and that's what we've done. We should have done it sooner. Now that we have done it, I think we're going to see continued good results, as we talked about today. We're going to see the opportunity for more investments in American workers, in American jobs, in American families, in American businesses, and that investment will pay off for all of us. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back.